The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, David Becker on the myth of voter fraud and its damage to democracy. Dr. Lisa Cooper on why health disparities are everyone's problem. Plus, Bill Press with Adam Serwer, author of the new book, The Cruelty Is the Point, the past, present, and future of Trump's America. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. David Becker works to build voter trust and participation. As baseless claims of voter fraud persist, he warns that we could become unable to govern ourselves in between elections. And we say hello to David Becker, Executive Director and founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research. David Becker, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. And as we get started here, David, if you could, just tell us a little bit about the Center for Election Innovation and Research and how it got started in the first place.
Sure. Well, I've been working in elections for nearly a quarter of a century now. Got my start working as a lawyer in the voting section of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice back during the Clinton administration, and continued working into the W. Bush administration. Eventually found my way to the Pew Charitable Trust, where I ran their elections program. And in 2016, Pew got out of the election space, and I didn't think the work was done. So I and a colleague left Pew and started the Center for Election Innovation and Research to kind of continue the work we have been doing on improving voter registration, improving the convenience and integrity and security of elections, election cybersecurity, and other issues, particularly working with the election officials of both parties and all around the country to assist them as they try to ensure an election system that voters should trust and do trust. And as it turned out, the timing couldn't have been better in some ways, unfortunately, because 2016 through 2021 has really been a time of remarkable attacks on the idea of democracy and attacks on the confidence of citizens in a democracy in their elections process.
Yeah, I mean, it's a completely different animal now than it was 4 or 5 years ago. But as we were heading into this past election, what was your sense then of how much voters trusted the system to record their votes accurately?
So in general, the confidence in elections has been pretty high up until 2016. What we would see is we'd see some variations between the parties based on who won. For instance, if in 2004, Republicans were somewhat more confident than Democrats, and in 2008, it was vice versa. But overall, confidence was relatively high in our elections process. We started seeing deterioration after the kind of unprecedented attacks by candidate and then President-elect and President Trump in 2016 and 17. And of course, those attacks on democracy and elections continued, really coming from the White House in many ways, through 2020 and even to this day. And we're seeing kind of long-term impacts and reductions in voter confidence, particularly centering on President Trump's supporters. We saw that in Georgia, where fewer people who supported the former president voted in the Senate runoffs than others. We saw Republicans being disproportionately affected by the election rigging narrative, the false narrative about election rigging. And it's having a disproportionate impact on on Republicans right now, it appears.
Mm-hmm. And despite the evidence, there are still or a significant number of people and lawmakers who want to challenge this election. Do you have a sense of where that distrust comes from, or is that an obvious answer?
Well, I think it's both obvious and not obvious in many ways. It's really distressing. We objectively just went through the most successful, transparent, verified, secure election in American history. We had more auditable paper ballots than ever before in American history. Every single battleground state, the voters voted on paper. The ballots that were paper, that were auditable, were actually audited. Famously, we had the presidential ballots counted 3 times, 3 different ways in the state of Georgia, including once entirely by hand. We had more pre-election litigation clarifying the rules. Both campaigns brought cases. Both campaigns won some cases and lost some cases, but everyone knew what the rules were on November 3rd. And we had more post-election litigation than ever before confirming the results, with unanimous courts, including Trump-appointed judges, confirming that Trump lost the election. So despite all of those facts, we still see the losing candidate trying to rally his supporters to believe that he didn't lose an election, which actually wasn't all that close. When you look at presidential elections in the 21st century, this was the widest margin of victory for any presidential election where Barack Obama wasn't on the ballot. And from the perspective of these state elections in Georgia, which was over 10,000 votes, Arizona, which was over 10,000 votes, Nevada, which was over 30,000 votes, Michigan, which was over 150,000 votes. Some of those margins might appear small from the perspective of a percentage, but from the perspective of an audit or a recount of those ballots, those are landslides. Anyone who does this work will tell you a margin of over 1,000 ballots is basically impossible to overcome. It's never happened in American history. A margin of 10,000 ballots is a landslide.
And yet we still have auditing going on, being talked about as a possibility going forward. To me, this is akin to digging a hole, filling it back in, and digging a hole again. It doesn't make any sense. What do any of these groups think they're going to find, especially with what you just elaborated on?
Well, of course, these I don't even call these things audits. They're not audits by any definition of the word. They're these kind of reviews of ballots that are being done right now are being conducted by incompetent, inexperienced, biased individuals who don't know what they're looking for, who have already expressed their biased belief that the election was stolen, and who, quite frankly, are trying to engage in grift, to surround themselves around the former president and to continue to con people out of their hard-earned money by telling them the lie that the election was stolen. I view the supporters of the former president who are contributing to these efforts really as victims of a con. And it's unfortunate. They're being lied to so that they will remain angry and donating. The simple answer is they'll find nothing. These ballots have been counted and audited multiple times. There is nothing to find because we know the results. This is just an expression of being unable to accept the outcome of an election that has been absolutely verified. And to be honest, they're not designed to find information. When you see the members of the Arizona Senate who authorized this so-called audit say, well, we're not trying to overturn the results of the election. We're just trying to get some answers here so we can educate people who doubt that the election was right and it will form our policy. And then they show up this past weekend at the premiere of a conspiracy-laden movie produced with money from Mike Lindell, I believe, and with Mike Flynn there. You can see how this is all playing into part of a larger grift on the former president's supporters, that it's not designed to shed light on anything. It's not going to yield any facts. In fact, as the former Republican Secretary of State of Kentucky pointed out in a report that he issued last week, the way the audit has been designed could not yield any facts. There's so many fundamental flaws in the design of this audit. They've destroyed chain of custody. They have inexperienced people who have changed standards multiple times. They've excluded the media. Various things that just at a basic level render this so-called audit a total fraud.
Mm-hmm. Now, in a recent article about this ongoing effort to question and even overturn what we know, and as you've pointed out, a well-run election, you were quoted as saying, "This is going to take years, if not decades, to fix the damage being done to our democracy." What are your biggest concerns?
I have three big concerns, I think. First, there are ongoing threats that are being directed at election officials and election workers all over the country, Republicans and Democrats. There was an article that came out just a few weeks ago that the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, his wife was receiving text message threats as recently as April 24th, and they might still be continuing. There are election officials of both parties who still have to have police protection on them and their families that are being doxxed by people who are disappointed in the results or who are conning others who are disappointed in the results, simply for doing their jobs and doing them well. The second thing I'm very concerned about is we're getting to the point where elections don't have consequences, where elections don't have meaning, where despite the fact that the rules were in place on November 3rd, that these rules in Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin were all passed by Republican legislatures. They knew the rules going in, and now they want to change the rules after the election because they didn't like the outcome, and that we will always incentivize the losers to doubt that the election was valid means that we're going to lose a fundamental aspect of our democracy, which leads to my third concern, which is not only that we're doubting the outcomes of elections, but that we are going to be unable to govern ourselves as a democracy in between elections, because the people who have won the elections, the doubt will surround their legitimacy during their entire term. We're seeing this happen in Arizona. Arizona is such a good example of this, where 20 of the 30 members of the Arizona Senate, which authorized this so-called audit, are actually on the ballots in Maricopa that they are casting doubts about, including 11 of the 16 Republicans who authorized this. They are casting doubt on their own elections by authorizing this audit. And what's the result? They can't even pass a budget in Arizona right now. In Texas, the legislature adjourns without a quorum because they can't pass legislation around voting rights that are based on the lie of a stolen election. We're seeing this in Congress as well. So if we can't govern ourselves as a democracy, we will be serving the arguments that autocratic forces around the world have been trying to make for a long time. Chinese Communist Party, Russia, et cetera, that you need a strong authoritarian central government. Democracy doesn't work. And that never worked in the United States. We always believed democracy would work. But right now we have people in the United States making that argument better than the Chinese Communist Party ever could.
It's pretty tough stuff to swallow. We're speaking to David Becker, Executive Director and founder of the nonpartisan, nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research. And as someone who works around the country to increase voter trust and participation, what can be done at the local level to help accomplish this?
Well, I think we really need to support our local and state election officials primarily. And that includes supporting them when they are of the other party than yourself. We need to trust these people. These people are professionals. I've worked with them for 20 years. It doesn't matter whether they're Republicans like Secretary Raffensperger in Georgia or Secretary Sagaski in Nevada, or Democrats like Secretary Hobbs in Arizona or Secretary Benson in Michigan. They are all professionals. They're all doing really good work. And they ultimately want to give voice to the will of the people. And so we need to support them through various ways. And that means not supporting ideas that involve election denial. While we're seeing this overwhelmingly on the right now, there have absolutely been efforts at times by some on the left to deny election outcomes as well, and to allege elections were hacked or somehow stolen when they weren't. It is not morally equivalent. It's not the same thing. It's not being done on anything close to the same scale. But there is sometimes an effort when you're naturally disappointed to believe that something happened where the election was denied, and not understanding that there are so many checks and balances in place. There are so many security precautions to ensure that the outcome is correct. Paper ballots, audits, etc. And that brings me to my last point, which is one of the best things anyone could do to really see how all of these checks and balances are in place, is to volunteer to be an election worker, a poll worker. They need people who know what they're doing. You will see this from the inside. You will see how chain of custody is maintained, how many security processes there are around the process. It's very hard to doubt the process when you see it from the inside and you can see how secure it is.
And David, what about our national political leaders? As you pointed out in Arizona, here, Maricopa County, they're up for these elections that they're questioning themselves, basically, and putting those doubts into their constituents' minds. What should be their role now in maintaining integrity and restoring faith in elections? And can you even imagine the two sides of the aisle agreeing on what that means?
Well, I think let's point out the people who have been truth tellers, who have been heroes, even if we disagree with them on certain policies at times. People like Liz Cheney, people like Adam Kinzinger, people like Anthony Gonzalez in the House, people like Secretary Raffensperger and Secretary Sagaski, who oversaw elections in their states. These people have been truth tellers. They have been the people who've been telling even their own disappointed voters that the election was valid, that the right person won. And honestly, in doing so, they're helping their own party, because if their own party misdiagnoses the reason that they lost, there's no way they can fix that in the future. And we saw the results of that in Georgia, where fewer Republicans showed up to vote in the January runoffs than Democrats did, and largely due to the fact that the former president was telling them that their vote didn't matter, that the election was rigged. People don't show up to vote when that happens. So there have been truth tellers, but unfortunately, there have been too few. When there are too few members of the former president's party who are willing to stand up and tell the truth to their own supporters that he lost the election, that it wasn't close, that Republicans down ballot actually did much better than Trump did. It was a relatively good election for Republicans. They expanded their lead in state legislatures. They actually won virtually every toss-up race in the House. This is not a hard message to swallow, but so few have been willing to do that. And of course, the result is that we even see congressional leaders refuse to vote to have a bipartisan investigation of the attack on their own House on January 6th. So I think it's easy to prescribe what these political leaders could do or should do. What's a lot harder is how do we get to the point where they will do it, because we're not seeing it right now on the kind of scale that we need to.
David Becker, Executive Director and founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. David, we appreciate your time with us. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This is great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the impact of health disparities on our entire society. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Most people believe the American economy is rigged by and for bankers, CEOs, and other super-rich elites because it is. With their hired armies of lawmakers, lobbyists, lawyers, and the like, they fix the economic rules so ever more of society's money and power flows uphill to them. Take corporate CEOs. While 2020 was somewhere between a downer and devastating for most people, the CEO class made out like bandits, with each of the 3 top-paid corporate honchos pocketing as much as $1 billion in personal pay. Are they geniuses or what? What? All 3 of their corporations ended 2020 with big financial losses and declining value. So how can such mediocrity produce such lavish rewards? Simple. Rig the pay machine. Today's corporate system of setting compensation for top executives is a flim-flam disguised as a model of management rectitude. On its face, it sounds good. Pay for performance, it's called, meaning the CEO does well if the company does well. But who defines doing well? The scam at most major corporations is that the standard of corporate performance that the chief must meet to qualify for a huge payday is set by each corporation's board of directors. Guess who they are? Commonly, board members are the CEO's hand-picked brothers-in-law, golfing buddies, and corporate cronies. So they set the bar for winning multi-million-dollar executive paychecks so low that a sack of concrete could jump over it. This is Jim Hightower saying, well, can't corporate shareholders just vote no on any executive excess? Yes, but corporate rules decree that votes by shareholders are merely advisory, meaning top executives can ignore them, grab the money, and run. The system is fixed, and we need to break it. Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Dr. Lisa Cooper has dedicated her career to eliminating disparities in healthcare. In her newest book, she makes the compelling argument that these inequities are harming all of us. And we say hello to Dr. Lisa Cooper, director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Equity and the Urban Health Institute. She's also a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Health Equity and James F. Freese Professor of Medicine. Most recently, she is the author of Why Are Health Disparities Everyone's Problem? Dr. Lisa Cooper, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. And as early as March 2020, when COVID-19 was just emerging, you told U.S. News that you expected the pandemic to impact African Americans to a greater extent than other more socially advantaged groups. What led you to make this prediction?
So I made this prediction because we really have a very large body of scientific evidence that links various manifestations of structural inequities in our society to poor health in socially disadvantaged groups, including African Americans and other people of color. And there's an old adage that says when America catches a cold, Black America catches pneumonia. So, we know that structural inequities have led to people from socially disadvantaged groups living in neighborhoods that don't have access to healthy food, educational or employment opportunities. There are not as many safe environments with quality housing or access to quality of healthcare in those neighborhoods. And people experience a lot of stress associated with these negative exposures, and they experience discrimination. And so that leads to the earlier onset of chronic conditions, things like obesity, heart disease, and diabetes among Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, and the poor. So I really predicted that all of these factors, including being overrepresented among frontline and essential workers, would decrease their ability to engage in social distancing and increase the risk of infection in these groups. And because of lower access to healthcare, they would be less likely to get testing and early treatment. And then because of their higher representation among people with chronic conditions, if they did get COVID-19, they would be more likely to be hospitalized and possibly to die.
And sadly, you were right. Your new book makes a powerful argument, which is that health disparities cannot be seen as only a problem for disadvantaged communities. Why is this an argument that needs to be made?
Well, I think it's an important argument to make because if many people think it's only a problem for disadvantaged communities, they may not realize how it impacts our entire society and why they should care and really get involved in the solutions.
Now, obviously, COVID-19 has opened our eyes, or at least I would hope, to how health inequities have a much broader impact beyond disadvantaged communities. What are some of the other ways that happens that we may be less aware of?
So as I mentioned before, health inequities lead to an enormous burden of human suffering, premature deaths, and bereavement of survivors living in disadvantaged communities. But there are also broader negative influences on our entire society. So in societies that have a lot of inequity like ours, we all experience worse health outcomes and social well-being. We don't live as long as people in more equal countries, and nor do our children. We are actually more obese. More of our teenagers get pregnant. We incarcerate our citizens at higher rates. Our children score worse on their math and science tests. We trust each other less, and we actually have higher homicide rates. We spend more on healthcare without necessarily realizing the benefits of that through better quality of life. And then we suffer from lost productivity in our economy. So when we have more social inequity, we see greater civil unrest, such as we saw in the past year with the protests following the murder of George Floyd. We have more conflict between social groups, like we've seen in the past year with the rise of domestic terrorism and the storming of the Capitol on January 6th of this year. And so we have this state of social inequality that really leads to a lot of dysfunction where people realize that we're not all in the same boat, and there's kind of a constant struggle for survival and advantage that leads to negative outcomes for everyone, just more stress and more illness and more dysfunction in our society.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to Dr. Lisa Cooper, director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Equity and the Urban Health Institute. And most recently, she's the author of Why Are Health Disparities Everyone's Problem? The Center for Health Equity that you founded at Johns Hopkins works to make healthcare institutions more equitable. And one of the practices you promote is community-based research. How is this different from what often happens in healthcare research, and how can it make a meaningful impact in advancing health equity?
So in community engaged research, people who are affiliated with each other by virtue of being geographically close to one another or share some special interests or have some similar situation work together with one another individually and through groups to address issues that affect the well-being of their community. So community-based participatory research is research that integrates education and social action to improve the health of a community and to reduce health disparities. So it's not really a specific set of research methods, but it's an orientation to research that focuses on relationships between academic and community partners. And there's co-learning, there's mutual benefit, and there's usually a long-term commitment. So the community members are involved throughout the research process as equal partners, from identifying the questions to working with researchers to get funding, to refining the research procedures and materials to make sure they're acceptable. They help to figure out how to recruit study participants, how to train the staff and the students. They also are involved in co-authoring research articles and helping the researchers share the results of the research with their neighbors and their colleagues and friends and with policymakers. But this is different from what usually happens in healthcare research, because typically what happens in healthcare research is that researchers define the health issue to be studied. They develop the study design, they create the programs to be tested, and they do this based on theories or on data rather than actually asking people who are living through these issues. And they analyze the data, they interpret it themselves, and they share it mostly with scientific audiences. So it's really important that we use community engaged research because it helps to build trust with communities that really have a lot of legitimate reasons to distrust science and medicine. And then the programs that we develop are, as a result of this more community engaged approach, more effective, more acceptable. And then we build greater capacity within our communities, more empowerment. And then the project actually itself has a longer impact, a longer term impact on the community, on its health.
So this is then a much broader approach, which in turn educates a greater number of people about whatever happens to be studied at the time.
Absolutely. And it's critically important to do this because, how do researchers know what the right question is to ask or how to do the work appropriately? We might be not studying the right problem, or we might be doing something that's scientifically very sound, but that just doesn't resonate with people who are living with the problem. And so therefore, it's never going to be used, and and no one's really going to benefit from it.
Is it kind of a taking it out of the clinic and taking it into the neighborhood or to the community and that kind of thing?
Absolutely. We talk about the fact that we really need to, with communities, what's been said is that there should be nothing about them without them. So it's nothing about us without us is what the slogan typically is. And really, if we really want to change lives, we have to take research out of laboratories and out of clinics and hospitals and really get it out into the community and out into the places where people live, work, play, and pray.
Now, another focus of the center is to influence how policy decisions are made from the local to national level. What do you believe policymakers need to better understand if they want to be a part of the effort to promote health equity?
So I think policymakers need a deeper understanding of the conditions that actually lead to health inequities and the actions that it would take to basically upend this whole, entrenchment of these problems at all levels. And so for a long time, policymakers have really looked at the opportunities for Americans in health, education, employment, housing, criminal justice, what have you, as separate issues. And they haven't really seen them as issues that are really connected to one another. They've also seen them as issues related to personal choices made by individuals. So I really think policymakers need to see the patterns that these inequities actually represent broader structural issues, factors related to policies and systems and to history. And those factors actually shape the opportunities that individuals have to make healthier choices. So it's not all about individuals and how they make these, disparate choices in all these different places and contexts, but they're all connected and they're all related to sort of the context and the structure. So we need to understand that that's a lot about how our own society, has attitudes and has choices that have valued certain groups over others. And so those attitudes have actually given power to certain groups of people, and that's shaped our laws and policies. And so we really need to have policies that address social determinants of health. So we need to move beyond just understanding the roots of these issues to really developing systematic, positive solutions. And really, simply put, we need to put health as a part of all the policies we do. So it's really called a health in all policies approach. And so health equity needs to be infused into everything we do, whether it's about healthcare directly or whether it's education or housing or economics or even climate change. We really need to think about the potential health impacts of those factors and how they might impact people who are less advantaged than others. So we've got to collaborate across sectors, and that's what policymakers need to understand.
Now, in your book, Why Are Health Disparities Everyone's Problem?, you write about a very compelling concept, which is that the kind of herd immunity that we seek as a response to COVID-19 virus can have a much broader reach. Tell us about that idea.
Sure. Yeah. So the scientific definition of herd immunity is that it's a phenomenon that occurs when a large portion of the community, which we call the herd, becomes immune to a disease. And that makes the spread of the disease from person to person unlikely. And so the whole community becomes protected. So it's not only those who are immune themselves, but the entire community. And this usually happens because of natural infection or by vaccination. And so the level of vaccination that we need to achieve herd immunity varies according to what the disease is. But in my book, I write about a new kind of herd immunity. And my colleague, Dr. David Williams, and I Dr. David Williams is at Harvard, and he's a sociologist. He's in the School of Public Health. We write about a new kind of herd immunity where all racial, ethnic, and social class groups become protected from the effects that are either visibly visible or easily witnessed, such as when we've seen the violence perpetrated against people of color by the police, to those that are maybe not as visible. So when people are protected against those negative effects of discrimination and disadvantage, and when they have their basic needs met, so their basic needs for stable housing, for a safe environment, for access to healthy food, a good education, a job that pays a living wage and quality healthcare, when they have protection through having all those basic needs met, then that's when we'll really have a different kind of herd immunity, which is protection against all those negative factors. And then our whole society will be healthier. So I really hope that, through reading my book, that, I will be able to raise awareness around this issue so that people will be able to see the injustices associated with not having this broader type of herd immunity. And, that even though it's not possible for one person to reverse this entire situation, but conversations among different people that actually shape policy and action, that we can achieve a healthier and more just society.
Absolutely. It takes all of us. That's for sure. The title of the book, Why Are Health Disparities Everyone's Problem? The author, Dr. Lisa Cooper, director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Equity and the Urban Health Institute, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Dr. Cooper, we appreciate your time with us today. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Thank you again so much for having me.
Our pleasure. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with journalist and author Adam Serwer on the ideological history that gave rise to Trump.
I think in some ways, due to his personality, he seems sui generis, but the truth is that since the founding, Americans have been fighting with each other over who is entitled to the blessings of American democracy. And Donald Trump represented ideological currents that have long argued that certain people should be excluded from those blessings, that those blessings are really only truly belong to conservative white Christians. He didn't come up with that. That's something that has been in existence since the founding. The founders, of course, declared that all men were created equal. What they really meant by that was white men who owned property. Millions of Americans didn't have the right to vote. Black men didn't have the right to vote until the 1860s. Women didn't have to vote until the 20th century. And because of Jim Crow, Black people in general, we only really began this fragile experiment with multiracial democracy that we've had since 1965. Only then was America fully a country for all its people on paper. So it was a bit strange to say, as many liberals did in the aftermath of the 2016 election, this is not who we are. Well, no, it's a part of who we are. It's not all we are, obviously, but it is genuinely a part of the American tradition and the American idea, and has been a source of conflict between those who have wanted to expand the ideals of the Declaration of Independence to everyone in the United States and those who have wanted to restrict it to a select few.
And as a result of that, you also point out that while Donald Trump may be he himself, right, gone from the Oval Office, that Trumpism has not gone away and is not likely to go away, correct?
Obviously the book title is The Cruelty of the Point. And most people think of cruelty as an individual problem. And it is that, as part of human nature. Everybody's capable of cruelty. But what I'm focused on is cruelty as a part of politics. And specifically what I said earlier, the way it's used to demonize certain groups so you can just justify denying people their basic rights under the Constitution and exclude them from the political process. I mean, one example of this is, Thomas Jefferson arguing that Black people are intellectually inferior to white people and incapable of the same higher thought processes that white men are, which of course justifies their enslavement. And currently our system incentivizes this because the structure through gerrymandering, Senate malapportionment, the Electoral College allows one party to hold power without winning a majority of the votes. So it becomes more urgent to persuade, this one group that they're on the verge of destruction. And so everything they do to prevent that is justified. That's how you end up with attempting to disenfranchise rival constituencies, Muslim bans, laws attacking trans children, stuff like that. It's because these acts of cruelty become not simply, acts of self-defense, but sort of acts of heroism against this tide of apocalypse that is imminent. And you can see this in Donald Trump's rhetoric. I'm the only thing standing in between you and annihilation. And it's just not true. I mean, there's always going to be people with conservative views on immigration, on religion, on economics. But what we have had in our history is periods when people are excluded from the franchise, are excluded from the political process because of who they are. And you can see that political project continuing even though Donald Trump is gone.
So Trump is hiding behind maybe this myth of economic anxiety that most of the media, as you point out, bought into through his campaign and the early time of his presidency. Was it Charlottesville that ripped the mask off and maybe George Floyd that showed that it's really a lot deeper than that and really is systemic, historic racism?
So I would say it was earlier. Look, I think one of the ways this argument gets confused is people conflate genuine economic grievance with the response to that grievance. So the Obama administration response to the Great Recession was genuinely inadequate. The stimulus was not big enough. They did not work hard enough to keep people in their homes. They let the banks get away with too much. But it does not follow from that the answer is to separate families or ban Muslims from traveling to the United States. If you look at the incredible racial disparities and the impact of the Great Recession, most of the people who were deeply hurt by it disproportionately were people who voted against Donald Trump in 2016. That is, they were Black and Latino voters to whom Trump's solutions did not appeal because they targeted them. And so it's not enough to say that Obama's response to the Great Recession was insufficient and left a lot of people suffering. What's necessary is an ideological lens that allows you to view that suffering as the fault of another group who must then be crushed, because that will then end your suffering. And so I think from the beginning, it was clear that it was not, in my view, economic anxiety, even though some of the people who voted for Trump framed their arguments in economic terms or justified their vote in economic terms. The existence of a given problem or a given grievance does not necessarily justify the pursuit of a specific solution. I think that's clear to everyone, but I think sometimes it gets mixed up. To say that struggling economically makes you racist is, in my view, an extremely classist view. I mean, when you look at, if that was true, the planter class of the Confederacy could never existed because they were certainly not economically anxious, even though they obviously had an economic interest in slavery. They were racist and white supremacists because that provided them with an ideological justification for the use of slave labor to make themselves rich. It's not simply enough to say, well, I had a hard time or I lost my house, or somebody lost their house, so they voted for Donald Trump. A lot of people who lost their homes or whose homes went underwater did not decide that a Muslim ban was the answer to their problems.
And in fact, you point out and include in the book the actual numbers of low-income voters that Hillary Clinton got versus Donald Trump, and prove that point, with the actual results from the election. Adam, I thought I knew a lot about American history, but I learned a lot from your book. One of the things I learned was about a guy named Madison Grant. I had never heard of Madison Grant, but he and David Duke, but particularly Grant, is a precursor of Donald Trump in terms of preaching white genocide.
Madison Grant's a very interesting figure because he's been kind of memory hold. I mean, if you're a hardcore white supremacist, you know who he is.
I guess I'm not. I'm glad I'm not.
But as I mentioned in the book, Richard Spencer wrote like an intro to Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race. And what you got to understand about Grant is he's this guy who just came up, he sort of synthesized all these like racist ideas that were circulating in the 19th century and 20th centuries, and said basically that the accomplishments of all Western civilization were due to Northern Europeans, who were also the, quote, native stock of Americans. And therefore, the new European immigrants who are coming over, largely, Mediterranean, Italian, Greek, Jewish, Armenian, these people were of inferior genetic stock, and they were going to annihilate the original pure white stock of America, and therefore destroy its capacity for self-governance. Now, this probably sounds familiar to you at this point, both as, what you might hear on Fox News at night, but also because, this philosophy and what he called it was race suicide, because the term genocide hadn't been coined yet. This was, in the teens and 20s. So, the Holocaust had not happened. The term genocide was not yet coined. But this Grantian idea that immigration erases the stock of pure white inhabitants from whom the country's greatness stems is the precursor to the racist white genocide conspiracy theory, which you can sometimes hear laundered or attempted. You can sometimes hear conservative intellectuals attempting to launder it in nicer terms, and nicer obviously is relative, such as when Tucker Carlson said that Democrats want to import more obedient third world voters, as if people, non-white people are more obedient than white people. It's extraordinary. And by extraordinary, of course, I mean extraordinarily racist. Grant, of course, he was influential in the sense that he helped design the immigration laws in the 20s that restricted Asian and African immigration and immigration from Southern and Eastern European countries as a way to keep out Mediterranean and Jewish immigrants. And he was a big influence on the Nazis when they were developing their theories of racist citizenship and the sort of white supremacist civilization that they wanted to build. And so, Grant has been kind of memory hold in part because the United States then went to war against Nazi Germany, and that sort of twisted reflection of, these ideas that had become popular in America, which merged with, centuries of anti-Semitism in Europe, it manifesting in this horrific genocide. We memory hold that because we didn't want to think about our ideological contribution to that. And there were distinctions. I mean, here in the United States, white supremacists wanted what's called a Herrenvolk democracy. They wanted a democracy where white people could vote and non-whites were subordinate citizens. They didn't want to live in a European-style fascist society. But nevertheless, that idea, again, it's a manifestation of what I was talking about, the contradiction of the founding that says, all men are created equal, but then, restricts those rights to white men with property.
Right. And Isabel Wilkerson in Caste also talks about the influence of America's racist laws and movement on the Nazis and how they looked at them for ideas of laws that they might write. Adam, let me ask you, to what extent has the Black Lives Matter movement, do you think, woke up America and maybe instituted some frank admission about our racist past and a willingness to deal with it?
Black Lives Matter accomplished something extraordinary, which is that they're the most popular civil rights movement in the history of the United States. The actual civil rights movement was not that popular at the time, even though we all remember it as a heroic movement. The New York Times reported the protests that occurred after the George Floyd murder were, maybe the biggest in American history. And now, of course, we're dealing with a backlash. We're dealing with a backlash in part because a Democrat is president now. Donald Trump's gone. And one of the effects of that, what political scientists call thermostatic public opinion, is that there is a reaction against the party in the White House. And to some extent, even though Black Lives Matter would not associate themselves with the Democrats, they are associated with the left. And therefore, there's a certain amount of backlash against them, also because there's been a rise in homicides that is being, in my view, unfairly blamed on Black Lives Matter since, the policy changes that they wanted weren't actually implemented.
Right.
But I think there was a kind of a moment where people's understanding of systemic racism genuinely expanded. I don't know what the long-term implications of that will be, and I don't know if the political possibilities of the moment are, given the narrow majorities that Democrats have in both houses, I don't know that will be reflected in policymaking. And I also think to some extent that recognition was limited to a certain segment of the country. So I'm not sure what the long-term effects will be, but certainly, even by what it accomplished, it was one of the more successful protest movements we've seen in American history.
Bill Press with journalist and author Adam Serwer. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. David Becker, Dr. Lisa Cooper, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.